Okay, this video is going to be about cold related emergencies. If you're following along in your book, this is going to be chapter 20. And what we're going to find with cold related emergencies is heat is going to travel from a warmer environment to a cooler environment. So your body's going to radiate heat. It's going to flow from a warmer or a higher temperature to a lower temperature. So we also lose heat to air. Definitely lose heat to water. It happens a lot faster in water. And we have some internal mechanisms where the body tries to control heat loss. Let me undo that real quick. So our internal mechanisms are vasoconstriction, and shivering. And shivering is a good cue of what's going on with an individual if they're experiencing especially hypothermia. So vasoconstriction, so we have a vessel here and then it becomes smaller, so there's less blood flow. So vasoconstriction, let's talk a little bit about it by itself. Vasoconstriction, the vessels are getting smaller, so they tighten down. Tightening, and that reduces blood flow. So what you have is somebody out in a cold environment. Let's just talk a little bit about this real quick. Your limbs act like radiators. So somebody with long limbs, it's not going to do as good in a cold environment because these limbs get blood supply. Let me change colors. The blood supply comes away from the core, cools it down, and we'll talk about this more in heat-related emergencies. So your blood, remember I talked about it being a thermoregulator. That's how it works. So it goes out here and cools it down. Well, in a cold environment, you start to shut blood supply down. So instead of it going out to the extremities of the tissues, it stays closer to the core to help keep you warm. So it tries to keep more blood here in the core. So ectomorphs, people that are really tall, thin, with long limbs, they do better in the heat because they can cool down. The limbs act like radiators. Don't do so good in the cold. So people that are shorter arms, larger core, tend to do better in cold environments. So that's the reason vasoconstriction is so important, is because it helps reduce blood flow. And let's say this is the skin. Well, the blood flow doesn't get as far out, so instead of being right here on the surface of the skin, that vasoconstriction keeps it a little bit further away so that you're a little bit more insulated with your fat. So there are several genetic predispositions that can help you or harm you in a cold environment. We'll talk about those in a little bit. So let me change colors. So let's talk about shivering. Oops, if I can get my pen to write. Shivering is going to help keep you warm, increases heat production, so heat production goes up. And so this can be problematic if you're taking something like alcohol or even some forms of caffeine. Can cause the shivering to go away. So some drugs will cause shivering to go away, so they can be problematic in a cold environment. Heat loss occurs for several reasons. Conduction, convection, evaporation, and radiation. So with conduction, you're touching an object, so you're losing heat to an object. Say you're sitting on the ground, you'll lose heat to the ground. Air over the skin. Over skin would be convection. Evaporation, you're taking that liquid sweat to a gas. That's how you cool down in a hot environment, but you lose a lot of heat in a cold environment, sweating and it evaporating, or even just water evaporating off your skin. And then radiation is probably the most common way where you lose the most heat. So warm objects are going to radiate heat to a cooler environment. So let's go and talk about, since we talked about this a little bit, let's talk about susceptibility. So people that don't have a high level of physical fitness, because they're burning a lot more energy, they tire easily, they tend not to do as well in the cold, have less muscle mass to generate heat. Dehydration will affect you, because dehydration is going to make your blood more viscous, so it's going to be harder for your blood to flow around and harder for you to thermoregulate. Lean people, and we're talking about individuals without too much muscle mass as well. They're pretty skinny, kind of bony. Lean people, they don't have a lot of fat either, so they don't have fat or muscle. The fat insulates, muscle is going to generate some heat, and muscle will also help insulate your core as well. The elderly, and the main reason there is they're just not very fit, have less muscle mass, so they don't have the muscle to generate the energy. And then people that are taking alcohol or caffeine, and mainly for the reasons we talked about before. Now let's talk about some actual cold related emergencies before I run out of time. We have frost nip, and with frost nip it's just the surface of the skin that's being damaged. We haven't gotten down into the deep tissue. To care for this, you want to gently warm, maybe just by blowing on the hands would be good. Definitely get out of the cold environment, that would be your first step. Don't rub, because you can do tissue damage, so don't rub the skin. And then we have frostbite. More severe. There's really not a lot you can do out in the field other than just get out of that cold environment. Here we're having the tissue actually freeze, and it can cause the tissue to die. So it occurs for two reasons: tissue freezing, and then you have blood flow obstruction. So the blood supply is obstructed some way, and that can cause, because of lack of circulation, the body shutting down blood flow, then the tissue dies. And then, or it can just freeze, but it takes a pretty cold temperature to actually freeze tissue. It's much below 32 degrees. I believe it's around 28 degrees. It has to get to 28 degrees because it's not just water. I put a percent sign there. I'm at degrees. So that's frostbite. To care for this, not a lot you can do. Get out of the cold. Get to a warmer environment. You want to remove any clothing that may be wet. And you also want to remove jewelry, because the tissue may swell because of the damage, and seek medical help. All right, the last and probably one of the most important is hypothermia. Probably more common. Hypothermia. So your body temperature is too low with hypothermia, so it's dropped. Anytime your body drops below 95 degrees, you're going to experience hypothermia. And then if it drops below 80 degrees, most people die. Most will die if it drops that low. So it can happen any time of the year. So it doesn't just have to happen. If you're in a cold environment, hypothermia can happen. So if you're like wet in like a 70-degree room, and it doesn't matter what time of year, it can happen anytime. Shivering, they list a lot of different indicators, is probably your best key, and it can tell you a lot about what's going on. If shivering stops, but the person gets better, where they're coherent and can talk and circulation's better, and that's a good thing. So they get better, then they're probably okay. But if shivering stops and they get worse, what I mean by getting better or getting worse, they're not as coherent, their judgment's not that great, speech is slurred, have trouble moving around, have trouble moving their extremities, that's a bad sign. And so that's a good sign that the hypothermia is getting worse. So here's the reason it's really important to care for somebody is 50 to 80% of people that experience severe, we're talking about severe hypothermia, they die. So it's extremely important that they get the correct care so that they don't go from moderate to severe, because their chances aren't very good. One last thing I want to talk about before I end this is CPR. And you need to read the book. There's a lot of other description of when to use CPR and stuff like that with somebody that's experiencing hypothermia. When you check for signs of life, you're going to go for a little bit longer time. Instead of just 10 seconds, since they're experiencing hypothermia, their heart rate's going to be slowed. So maybe for 30 to 45 seconds, because their heart rate's going to be much slower. And CPR with a beating heart can cause it to go into cardiac arrest. So if they have a beating heart and you start doing CPR on them, you can cause them to go into cardiac arrest. So there's a whole big description on when you should do hypothermia. I don't have the time to go through all of it right now. If somebody's experiencing hypothermia. So I hope this helped out. I hope it explained some of the different cold related emergencies, and I'll see you in the next video.